was weird though, because it wasn't how they're always depicted in movies and stuff. It was almost like a horseshoe, but it went from shoulder to shoulder and had perfect triangles inside. The head was turned completely sideways to the right, so you could see its outline. My entire family saw it. My aunt said it looks like a monster, which I'll never forget. Later on, we asked my grandmother where the picture was, assuming she wouldn't be insane and throw it away, and she kept saying she didn't know what we were talking about. The second story. An encounter with the devil. This didn't actually happen to me, but it happened to my mum when she was a teenager. My mum now is in her mid-60s. She's not an overly religious woman. She doesn't read the Bible regularly, rarely goes to church, but she prays every night because that is what gives her comfort. I'll have to side note this with I watched normal horror movies with her every so often. Nothing too crazy or gory, but spooky. Well, I asked her if she wanted to watch The Exorcist, and she flat out 100% refused. She said there is absolutely no way she will ever watch anything related to possession or exorcisms. Wow, this was curious. So the movie Constantine comes out, and I show her the trailer, asking her if she wants to watch it. She sees the girl near the beginning, climbing the ceiling, and again just refuses. I should also note, my mother will refuse and kick you out of her house if you even think about bringing a Ouija board into the house. She'll yell, scream, and cuss until you drop the subject, and that's that. This is important to the story. Alright, so that little backstory out the way, I ended up asking her why exactly she refuses to watch those sorts of movies. Well, she tells me when she was a teenager at a sleepover at a friend's house, they were up playing games, the parents watching TV. Her friends and herself are on the floor playing a board game, a game my mum has never played before. We come to find out it's a Ouija board and she doesn't know what it does. They start playing and asking a bunch of questions. They end up finding out there is a spirit in the house, so they ask it to show itself. Nothing happens. They then demand it to show itself. This was her first indication something wasn't right, because the lights all around the house, every single room, went out immediately, including the TV, and then snapped right back on. Spooky, huh? Nah, just a fluke. They then ask the next question, who are you? The piece moves around the board in big circles, with their hands on it, and stops on the letter D. Moves to E, then V, I, L. Wow, someone must be messing with it. This can't be real. So they ask, if you are the devil, then show yourself. Nothing happens for a while, and then suddenly the TV goes out. In the reflection of the TV, sitting in the living room next to them, my mum and her friends, even her parents, could make out the shape of something terrifying just sitting there next to them. The house got extremely cold. Suddenly, loud noises could be heard in the kitchen, stuff flying off the top of the refrigerator, and cupboards opening and closing. They immediately stop the game, close it up and throw it in the trash, never to play one again. Later that night, my mum is sound asleep and is woken by something loud and clanging on the roof. She listens intently, and she can hear what sounds like chains and dogs up on the roof. Well, that's not possible. It must be outside somewhere. She wakes up the next morning and goes and talks to her friends' parents, asking them if any of their neighbours have any dogs. They tell her no, and they tell her they also heard the dogs and chains up internet. Our only computer was in the guest bedroom on the opposite side of the house from my room. The house was pretty wide, so I had to pass through 3 different rooms if I wanted to use the internet. So it's about 2 a.m. and I'm on the internet talking with friends or something. Anyway, some situation comes up where I need to get something from my room, so I exit the guest bedroom. I walk through the laundry room, tiptoe quietly through the kitchen, past my parents' bedroom, because the floors creak, and enter the living room. I'm 6 feet from my bedroom door when I hear this blood-curdling shriek. My eyes are almost tearing up from even thinking about it. It's coming right from beside my left ear, the side that the dining room table was currently on. As in, there is no space for anyone to stand there and scream in my ear. I sprinted to my room, slamming the door behind me, and grabbed whatever I came for. I still don't know why, a weapon maybe, and sat on the corner of my bed. The next morning, I asked my parents if my mother woke up shrieking that night, and they both just shook their heads. That was my first and only strange experience in that house. The funny thing is that after a while of sitting on my bed, I eventually went back to the computer to tell my friends what just happened. Story number 4. My ex-wife. My ex-wife had several weird experiences. I'll relate this one. I'm at work one day when she calls me out of the blue. We were still married at the time. She usually did not call me during the day because she worked the night shift. She tells me to call my friend Danny and make sure he and his family are okay. When I ask why, she tells me that she had a dream but can't remember it, but that I should call Danny and make sure he's okay. So I call Danny and check in with him. I tell him about my wife's dream. He's mildly amused but tells me that he and his family are fine and to thank my wife for her concern. I call her back and let her know all is well. She's very dubious when she hears the news. I found out later that within half an hour of my phone call to Danny, he got another call from his uncle in Florida to tell him that Danny's son had hanged himself. This next story is written by the same person who was talking about his ex-wife in another instance. My ex-wife was pretty sane and did not do this sort of thing often or lightly. The one other occasion that really comes to mind followed shortly after her father's death. She was very close to her father, and she was clearly his favorite child. His death traumatized her terribly. A few weeks after the funeral, she was working. She was a neonatal ICU nurse and was on her way back from the break room when a patient called out to her. Not seeing any other nurses around, she went into the woman's room to make sure she was okay and tell her that she would send the proper nurse around. A patient, an old Asian woman, told her, "Oh no, Heidi dear, I wanted to talk to you." She said the hair stood up on her neck and she got goose pimples all over because she had never seen this woman before, and there shouldn't be any way she could have known my wife's name. The Asian woman continued, "I was just speaking with your father, and he told me to tell you that there is more insurance. The papers are in a safe deposit box at the bank on Main Street in West Bend, and the key is hanging in the garage with the lawnmower keys." My wife is totally freaked out at this point, and the Haitian woman tells her, "Don't worry about a thing, your father is happy and feeling fine now. He told me to tell you that he loves you and that you shouldn't worry anymore." And that puts my wife over the edge. She runs from the room in tears, calls her mother back in Wisconsin, we were in New York, and tells her the whole story. Mum finds the key, goes to is it empty? She asks one of the nurses on that floor where she is. The nurse replies, she's in the morgue, she died last night. So there you have it. I suppose it's possible that my father-in-law had told my wife about the key and the insurance, but my wife swears he never did. She also swears every bit of this story happened. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but I'm not the one that's going to call her a liar. Why? Because 2 times in her life she wished someone dead, and both times that person died within 48 hours. The next story is called A Farmer. My mother-in-law was a very funny and cool woman. She and my wife were really close, and sadly she passed away when our son was about 4 months old. Flash forward a few years. We live in an old 1930s era craftsman house in Pasadena, California. Our son is about 3 at the time. I was giving him a bath one night, and he starts looking over my shoulder, not at random stuff, but at something. A moment passes, and then he asks me why Grandma calls Mummy a funny name. Long pause. I asked him what he meant, thinking he was talking about my mum. He then says, why does Grandma call Mummy? And then her nickname. My mother-in-law's nickname for my wife, which was very unique. I was really set back by this. My wife and I never used this nickname. It was just what her mum called her, since she was a baby. I asked him where he heard that. He said, the farmer told me. I asked him who the farmer was, and he replied, his friend. I tell my wife this story later, and she, of course, is reduced to tears over the whole nickname thing. We both know there is no way for him to know this, and we just kind of marvel at it. Flash forward to the next weekend, and my son is playing in his room. My wife is at work. She worked in retail, and I'm at home. I worked Monday to Friday. I hear him start talking like he's having a conversation. He's saying things like, yes, no, I don't know that, and then some laughing. I go into his room and ask him what he's doing, and he says, playing. I ask, with who? He says, the farmer. At this point I'm already thinking about the Exorcist movie and Captain Howdy. It's a little unsettling. I ask him where the farmer is. He says he left when I came in. What the hell? So my wife gets home and I tell her this, and now she's just as weirded out as I am. We have no idea what to do, and figure if it happens again, we'll do something. A few days later, in the middle of the night, we both overhear our son saying the following. Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore. Wife and I go check on him, both of us a little freaked out. He's just sitting up in bed. I ask if he's okay, and he says, yeah, Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore. He never once mentioned the farmer again after that, not ever. He's 13 now and doesn't remember any of it. We do though. Next story is called My Sister's Stalker. When I was young, I'd say 8 to 11-ish, my sister, who is 7 years older, would babysit me when my parents were out. At the same time, she smoked a lot. My parents made her smoke outside, of course. So I'd follow her outside into the carport, which faced the street, and play around, annoy her and such. One day my sister notices a car at the end of the driveway, just sitting in the road. It's a white SUV, I believe a mid-90s Bravada, not sure, with a bike rack on top. It has the most tinted windows I have ever seen. You could not see inside from the outside. It sat there until she went inside. watching my sister. If I didn't go out, I'd watch from the front window, and it would just sit there and watch my sister. She told my father, who was a sheriff deputy at the time, and he called the cops and made a complaint. They showed up, looked around, but the SUV was nowhere to be seen. Months went by and nothing. Then one day, a good 9 months after this had all started, and 4-ish since the last sighting, it was back. It became a regular occurrence again. Another day, my sister was outside doing her nasty habit, and sure enough, here it comes. This time we were alone as usual, and she decides she's had enough. She tells me to stay in the carport, and she's going to go confront them. She starts walking towards the SUV, and halfway down the driveway she would later remark to us, "I felt utter terror, like I knew if I went any further I was dead. I was paralyzed by pure fear." She turned around and went back inside. Finally, the family car was in the shop for some kind of issue, so we were all stuck at home for the night and had to get delivery, etc. While my parents are home, my sister goes outside to smoke. I go outside with her, and eventually the SUV shows up. She tells me to run inside and tell my father, and I do. My dad promptly gets his gun and starts briskly walking down the driveway with it in hand, in the direction of the SUV, but not leveled towards it. The SUV floored it down the road and peeled out onto the nearby large highway. My dad, being a cop, noted the year and model and distinguishing features. The scariest thing is the license plate had been covered in duct tape. We never saw it again, and my sister just kind of shrugs it off now. The next story, a Christmas horror story. A terrifying but true story I experienced when I was 12. I moved to my dad's when I was 10 and didn't know anyone in the area, except for the family my dad was friends with, a single mom with 3 kids. Luckily there was a girl a couple of years older than me, 12 at the time I met her, and we got to know each other a little over a couple of years. We weren't close, but ended up having the same friends. One night my friend Rob was hanging out with her and her younger brother. They happened to be in the house alone, because my friend's mum was at work, which is where this gets terrifying and sad. Her mother had been helping this one lady at her work and got to know her fairly well. She found out her sister was in a mental institution and was let out recently. The night Rob is hanging out with my friend, they get a knock at the door. My friend thought it was just their mum. She knocked a certain way when coming in and answered it without thinking. Rob wasn't supposed to be there, and he took off through the window to his house down the road. He never thought twice about it. It wasn't her mum. It was the sister of the lady her mum was helping, and she figured out through talking to her sister where her family lived and her mum's working schedule. She came in, and this is where I don't know the details, but I'm glad I don't. My friend's younger brother got away to the neighbours to call the police. The lady brutally murdered my friend a week from Christmas, decapitated her and left her body naked in a bathtub, hid her head. They had to look through the presents, and I don't know where they found it, but they did. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. Story number 9. My haunted grandparents. So my grandparents, for some reason, had a way of always moving into haunted houses. The houses weren't really creepy, but they would always have weird paranormal stuff happen. To keep the story short, I'll just give my experience. It was some would be in the hallway. Staying rational, I assumed my grandpa just got inside his bedroom before I saw him. So, when hearing the footsteps, I would wait till they were at the other end, where the cupboard with the Toms were. Then open the door. Nothing. Dark as the night could be. I got used to the sounds, since they weren't super loud or anything. It's just footsteps on a carpet. That I'm thinking I'm just hearing things half the time. One night I was laying in bed, just watching TV. The head of my bed shared the same wall as my bedroom door. One night I heard the footsteps. Whatever, they make their way down the hall. Then they come towards my end. Cool, I'm used to this by now and I usually just ignore it. Could be my grandpa, could be the ghost. But then the footsteps stop, and my doorknob makes a crazy clacking sound, as if someone is rapidly turning the doorknob without actually opening it. I jump out of bed, run to my door, and try to catch whatever it is. My grandpa can be a dick and possibly messing with me. Nothing. Dark as night, quiet as can be. I go to open my grandparents' door slowly, and I'm greeted with snoring. Story number 10. Close call. My sister and I were playing outside when we were younger, and an elderly couple was walking by our yard. Our yard had a cemetery in the back, so it was quite a common local attraction for tourists, as this house was built in the 1800s, and most of the graves were from children who died back then from the flu, etc. There are some creepy stories from that place, but nothing lives up to what happened all those years ago. Playing outside, and this old couple kept pestering my sister about what her name was, as they approached us and got closer. We were just little kids and got terribly scared, and ran inside and told our mum what happened. The following week, I heard a story on the news about an elderly couple approaching a teenage girl, kidnapping her and raping her, and it was the same couple that had approached my sister and I. I still get creeped out by that. Story 11. The demon in my room. I was with my boyfriend at the time. We were laying in my bed and the lights were out. We weren't talking, just both thinking, and all of a sudden he rolls over and hugs me tightly. I of course hug him back, but then this feeling just hits me. If I wasn't already laying down, it would have knocked me over. It was a total feeling of dread and panic. I'll admit, I have had panic attacks in the past, but this was not the same. I hugged my boyfriend back as hard as I could. I never felt a feeling like this before. My boyfriend is one of those people who is always really warm, but even in his arms I felt ice cold. I could feel this evil, awful feeling, and it seemed like it was coming from the corner of my room. It was like sensing your friend behind you when they weren't saying anything. I honestly believe there was a demon or something in my room. I got the courage to speak and I said, "Jay, do you feel that?" And he said he did. A cold, evil feeling. This all happened in about 30 seconds to a minute. He decided to call his friend who was studying to be a youth pastor. I got up and turned the lights on and came back to bed. He called Matt and put him on speakerphone. Matt prayed for us and we both closed our eyes and listened, praying in our heads. When the prayer was done, the room felt lighter and it wasn't cold anymore. But after a little small talk afterwards, Matt asked us, "Were you two talking while I was praying?" We said, "Of course not. We were just listening." He said he heard from the phone a deep, gravelly voice telling him to stop, and he said he felt an awful, evil feeling overcome him while he was praying. It freaked me out. two younger sisters shared a room, but they would come sleep in my room every once in a while because they said there were weird lights in their room. My parents passed it off as the street lights bothering them. One night I woke up to this weird feeling of anger. It was like when you were standing next to someone that was murderously pissed off at you. There was a shape of a person standing in the doorway and a single red glowing light, like the cherry of a cigarette. Both my parents smoked, so I thought it was one of them. I sat up and said, "Mom, Dad," but there was no response, and then the figure and the red light were gone. I pulled the covers over my head as quickly as possible and made myself into a tight little ball. Then there was a tug at the blankets at the bottom of the bed. I pulled the blankets back, and there was another tug. I was terrified and unable to move, so I just held on to the blankets as hard as I could. The tugging stopped, but I was frozen with fear. Eventually I fell asleep again. When I asked my parents about it in the morning, both of them said they were sleeping the entire night and it must have just been a nightmare. Fast forward some 20 years, I used to have nightmares about the house, but especially the corner of the garage turned den, which looked like a black hole in my dreams. It was a one-story house, but I used to have dreams of running downstairs into the den, where I knew if I went close to the black hole that something evil would get me. I also had dreams about other houses in the neighborhood being evil, and if I went to them for help, that I would die. My younger sister and I were talking about the house with our mum one night, and she described having almost the exact same nightmares, but we had never spoken about it before. In her dreams, she would run down the stairs into the kitchen, where the cupboards would be opening